otherwise. Okay, there we go.
It's working now. Awesome.
Excellent. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for coming to attend this session. This is linked data in library workflows. This is obviously a very well-attended session. We still have people coming in from the waiting room. Since we're a couple minutes late getting started, I'm going to go ahead and get into an intro for our presenter today. This is Jeff Mixter, Senior Product Manager at OCLC. He oversees linked data products and services with OCLC. And the title of this session today is Linked Data in Library Workflows. I'm personally really very excited about hearing this session. Throughout the session, if you have questions or comments, we encourage you to put that in the Slack.
Hi, my name is Jeff Mixer. I think someone muted everyone, so I'm just go ahead and get started. Feel free to interrupt me if there's more preamble stuff. So I want to thank everyone today for joining. In particular, I want to thank the organizers and the facilitators for the LD4 2023 conference. Again, I'm Jeff Mixter, and I'm going to be talking about library data and linked data and library workflows. So just sort of looking at the past sort of 2 decades of sort of linked data in libraries, something that has been, I think, an observation to me is that most work and conversations around linked data has been focused on cataloging and also discovery. But with the push for BibFrame, it's really focused on sort of evolving the cataloging workflows that we do in the library industry. And to that end, there's sort of 3 primary purposes for cataloging. There's inventory control, so you can help make sure that materials are accessible to patrons. There's registration of library materials, so you can understand if you have a record for a given book, and there's actually 5 copies of that book, you can appropriately inventory control those. And then lastly, what I'm going to be talking about primarily today in the presentation is knowledge work. And this is the work that catalogers, librarians in general do to help make things discoverable, usable, not only to the outside community, but also internally for all of the other library workflows that exist outside of traditional cataloging. And ultimately, then when we apply this back to linked data, I think that the real value here is being able to say things about materials that do not fit well into MARC. So because it is such a critical part of the transition to linked data, talking about cataloging just briefly. As I mentioned previously, there are components of cataloging and our sort of inventory control. Again, specifically, this can talk about localizing the descriptive metadata to the language of the user so they can find it and make it accessible, and also adding specific authorized access points based on the sort of expectations of patrons that are going to be accessing your OPAC. There's registration. Again, this is sort of setting holdings on things. So then, the way this works in linked data is if you have a set of catalogers, and sort of now all what you can do is actually access a graph of information to do your descriptive cataloging work. And in that large graph, you have things, you have concepts, you have organizations, you have sort of works from the Ferber-Wemme perspective, you have places, you have events, and then you have people, personal names. And so then from a linked data perspective in cataloging, the efficiencies here are that they're somewhat nuanced, but our efficiencies nonetheless is things like multilingual is supported by default in linked data. The idea of language cataloging, that notion somewhat goes away when we're looking at cataloging from a pure linked data perspective. And the other thing is that you can link, regardless of the authority you use, whether it be Getty, FAST, LCSH, whatever, you can link out to other like authorities to help sort of bridge your data together, regardless of what controlled access points or URIs you want to be using in your local cataloging data. So just an example of this, actually, this was something that my colleague Ann Washington talked about at the LD4 conference last year. These being able to bridge authorities across the library ecosystem. This is just an example from one of our WorldCat entities' person descriptions. And you can see that in here, we have links out to a large variety of both library and non-library identifiers. And I think the non-library identifiers are going to become increasingly important. Earlier in the week, there were presentations on linked data in video games. There's discussions of linked data in cultural heritage material as it relates to cultural preservation. And there's a large swath of other sort of adjacent industries that are important to the library community because those industries have materials that are important to library patrons, and being able to bridge together sort of industry identifiers and identifiers that we hold dear in the library community will be really important for work moving forward. So ultimately, the end result of linked data for cataloging is that it provides catalogers more time to do knowledge work to help their materials be found, explored, and most importantly, used. So now I'm going to transition into this knowledge work. I've been in our product management division for just under a year, but in my time, I've been working extensively with colleagues internally as well as external partners, development partners for our current linked data applications to really learn what is critical for your library workflows. And one of the undertones or undercurrents that has been persistent across all of the interactions is this idea of being able to do more with the data that we have available and having the time to create that new data. So one of the ways I think knowledge work can be very useful to the library industry is basically making our data work harder. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Identifiers can connect our data and can be used to actually derive new information. So this is a pretty simple example. I think we've all seen this in the past or are certainly well familiar with it. If you have 3 library materials and each of them has a subject heading, in this case, history, Geschichte, and Storia. Those are all 3 words meaning in general for history. Those are the German and the Italian translations or words for history. In a given ecosystem, this would probably be perfectly sufficient because the local library knows primarily the important languages of their patrons. But when you look at it in the aggregate, things get a little bit more messy because you don't quite know who your user is, what's critical to them, how they're going to be able to best access information. So being able to do things like pull together all of these subject headings through lexical mapping or just connecting those respective identifiers together can provide an environment where you now have language tagged headings for you that can be used in end user discovery experiences and produce things that we've all come to expect from using Google and other online services, sort of knowledge cards about the thing that you're working with or exploring. Again, this is a pretty low, low bar use case, but it is still an example of making our data work harder than it previously could do when it's locked into a MARC environment with where you just have a 650 with a given string, let's say. Another area where knowledge work is being really important is being able to connect existing data together better. So I'd also in earlier presentations, we talked, there's been discussions around linked data for materials that fall outside the traditional sort of print catalog, so electronic, digital materials. So just to walk through another example, even though I live in Central Ohio, I'm fascinated by surfing. And in particular, very interested in a surfer by the name of Phil Edwards, who was a pioneer surfer from the early 60s in California. And this was a book, a sort of an autobiography he wrote called You Should Have Been There an Hour Ago, The Stoic Side of Surfing, or How to Hang 10 Through Life and Stay Happy. I really like this book. I've read it quite a few times. But when I find this book, I'm now kind of locked there, right? I mean, I can do a search for Phil Edwards or surfing or something like that in my local library OPAC, but unless I know what to search for, the data about the bibliographic object itself is kind of a bit of a dead end. But using things like linked data, robust ontologies, identifiers, what you can begin to do from a library system perspective is help navigate users. So this is going beyond sort of serendipitous discovery. This is actually being able to provide, meaningful relationships for the end user to other materials in your catalog. So, what you can then connect to, let's say, would be a digitized interview called Surf and Shorts, in which Phil Edwards is one of the interviewees in this presentation or in this interview. You can also then branch out to other types of materials, say some digital material. So this is from Pepperdine University's digital collection of surfboards. This is actually a surfboard that Phil Edwards used. It's a Hobie surfboard, which is a large well-known surfboard manufacturer. So again, because of these connections of Phil Edwards, surfing, being in the data and meaningfully connected within the data, you can sort of suggest, if you will, other related resources and meaningfully explain to the end user why you're making these connections. You could also then connect to an article by Hobie Atler, who's the founder of the Hobie Surfboard Company, sort of talking about his motivation to become a surfboard and sailboat producer. And lastly, you could connect out to modern topics. So this is an article about the surfboard industry and the supply chain problems it had in 2022 to 2030 based on materials being available. Most of it actually at the beginning talks about sort of the pandemic, supply chain issues that they ran into. So again, I don't think that this is like groundbreaking, but what it demonstrates is facilitating with a robust model and the time to make these meaningful connections in the data. You can better connect print, electronic, and digital material and make it more easily navigable for end users as they explore materials, not only in your library collection, but in library collections around the world. Also, there's this ability just to say what you need to say. So again, just as a quick example, if you have a library material, it's pretty intuitive to say the material has an author, the material has a subject associated with it. And these are things that are perfectly fine to do in MARC. But it's when you get one hop out from there that things get a little more complicated, certainly in MARC, but are really well facilitated in a linked data environment. So being able to say that author works for, let's say, an academic department, and that academic department is part of a broader academic institution. So these are things that you can do from an authority file perspective somewhat, though the MARC authority format is a bit limited even in what you can say there. And then sort of hopping out even further, there you can have other people that can write about the same topic. I mean, we can sort of do this today with large data analysis, even across our MARC data. But again, taking a hop out further, that individual might work for an academic department themselves, which is also part of an academic institution. And I think this is where it becomes really critical. What you can then say, for example, are that these two academic institutions work together on a grant. And now what you've created is an indirect relationship between these two people outside of the fact that they might have written about a same topic. So I think that this type of knowledge work really starts to get at the root of what's possible in a linked data environment, and also really articulates how linked data can bridge outside of the cataloging perspective and start to incorporate other workflows within the library, such as researcher information management, special collections management, electronic resource management, things that have been traditionally siloed and traditionally have required their own sort of special curated subset of library data to be able to do what they need to do within their given workflows. And then ultimately, I think one of the great things is that this can provide more meaningful discovery. If you can say those things I mentioned previously on the slide, on the previous slide, excuse me, if a user finds that resource previously mentioned, they can obviously see the author, let's say. They might be able to find that other author based on a shared topic that they've written about. But there's all that other stuff I mentioned previously, the academic departments, the institutions, the grant that they might have worked together on, and then, say topics related to other outputs of that grant that were published, maybe not by these people, but by undergrad researchers or something like that. These materials can actually then provide a much more meaningful set of related result items for an end user to explore. So the sort of like more, it's like the step beyond the more like this, it's more the here are other related items and here are they, how are they explicitly related to the item you have found based on semantic chains throughout the graph. Having been an undergrad and graduate student researcher, it was things like this that I had to sort of mentally make by just finding materials and then mapping them back to materials I'd previously had in hand. But in a graph, there is the opportunity to make those relationships either explicitly defined in the graph or at the very least indirectly describable because of indirect paths between them. So that was sort of like the vision, sort of being able to bridge library workflows using linked data sort of outside the confines of just traditional cataloging, but looking at how when we apply linked data at the library system level, how can it adjust and add efficiencies or make things possible that were not previously possible in our sort of MARC-based world. And then just to wrap up, sort of like so I talked about the vision. Now I want to talk about sort of what are we doing at OCLC to sort of help manifest that vision. And I think the first thing we've been doing is just identifying the challenges that exist right now. I touched on some of these earlier, this increasingly complex and messy hybrid environment we live in, disparate URIs being used across different parts of the library or across different libraries, the lack of tools to support unified cataloging, the inability for data to serve multiple workflows. You have your workflow, you have your data for RIM systems, you have your data for cataloging, or you have your data for authorities. These silos across different workflows create barriers and also create not just barriers, but questions on the overall transition cost of linked data, right? If you can show that it impacts every system at a library, that's much more impactful than sort of focusing in on just a very specific cataloging workflow type of implementation. And ultimately, there's an absence of an ecosystem to sort of share and collaboratively create and manage and do this knowledge work in. So to help facilitate that knowledge work, what we've been focusing on is creating a robust set of entity data that can span workflows and facilitate interoperability across these data silos. We've been working on putting together a data model that can support the knowledge work that's needed to bridge these data silos. So expanding upon models that already exist to also incorporate really robust ways to describe relationships between materials, between what we traditionally call like authority entities and other authority entities. And we've also been working to develop tools and services, the ecosystem, to curate this data and integrate it into existing library workflows and applications. So to do that today, what we're really focused on, as I mentioned, our WorldCat entities data. We also curate and manage the FAST vocabulary as linked data. And lastly, we have DOI data. So we're going to be publishing DOI as linked data. So all of these three core data sets will be the data that we'll be focusing on to expand upon and incorporate with other sets of library data to start bridging these disparate workflows together. So just to summarize, The WorldCat entities data is a robust set of persons, places, events, and works to help sort of form the seed of entities that catalogers or librarians can then do knowledge work with. We have a data model that is expansive enough to cover all library data needs and workflows. And also our editor, Meridian, is a service, will be a service and tool to help sort of curate and reuse this data. And I think there are probably some folks on who had worked on our Meridian development partnership over the past 6 months or so. I mentioned earlier working with the community, and this was a set of people that worked very closely with us to better understand what does it mean to do this knowledge work, what's critical to libraries sort of now as they're either working in MARC for the foreseeable future, in the transition from MARC to linked data or non-MARC standards, or they're already in the non-MARC standard and they're wanting to apply it sort of across the library's system and library data. So with that, I wanted to spare some time for questions. If you have any questions or you want to reach out, please feel free. My name and email addresses, contact information is here. This is my passion. I've been working on it for over a decade in research, now in product management. So I'd love to talk both about down in the weeds technical aspects of linked data and RDF, but also at the sort of implementation at a library system perspective as well. So again, thank you everyone for joining today, and I will turn things over to Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff. We do have 2 questions already in our chat queue from Slack. I want to thank our Slack moderator, Ronnie, for facilitating these. So the first question comes from Joe Sarah. Is OCLC claiming any copyright of this aggregation of freely and publicly available content?
I can't really answer that right now. What I can certainly say, though, is in all of our linked data work, we are going to be following the standards and best practices of, for example, the W3C and the RDF specifications, and all related specifications. I can certainly get back with more information about that question specifically, but I don't have the information to comment on it right now.
All right. Second question. Even if not, how will these aggregations be licensed, or what will API service and tool access models be like? This comes from Dorothea Salo.
Yeah, so we're working on that right now. Again, this was part of our development partnership engagement we had. We're just sort of figuring out what are the use cases for the data, whether it be the application or the APIs to curate, create, reuse the data. So that is a work in progress that I can certainly talk more about later, but don't have any specific details to share right now. And also, just to follow up on that, if folks do have use cases or examples that they want to share out, I'd love to talk about those in terms of how these services could be integrated into the existing library work that you're doing.
Awesome. We don't have any other questions at the moment. I will reiterate, I know we had a very full waiting room and a lot of people that were joining a little bit late or dropped off a little early. If you were in this awesomely attended session and you still would like to review some things, I know that there is a PDF linked from the Schedge page that Jeff has added. So feel free to check out that document. And these YouTube sessions, they're live streaming now, but they're going to continue to be freely available. So that's one of the wonderful things about LD4 conference. And I personally am always grateful to go back and rewatch the pieces and save pics of the slides and get all those resources. So thanks for making that PDF available, Jeff.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
We have one more question. In addition to knowledge panels or cards, do you know of any other discovery use cases enabled by the work that's underway or could be integrated into linked data editors?
Yeah, so from a discovery standpoint, I think those ones that were mentioned in the chat are probably the most important ones. Actually, I mean, the presentation preceding this one, being able to ask natural language questions and get back results. One of the goals for building this sort of knowledge graph of library sort of data would be, for example, tuning a Chat GPT or whatever, a natural language processing engine to be able to take natural language questions from a library patron or library user and actually fire those questions against a knowledge graph, if you will, of library focused data. So I think that would be a very interesting experiment to run, in addition to what the previous speaker mentioned, which was really interesting of setting that up to fire against DBpedia. And maybe not so much a discovery use case, but being able to do this knowledge work, I think, can also be really impactful for internal library uses. So as federal agencies are having more and more stringent requirements for grants. One of the challenges we've heard is that it's difficult for libraries to assemble like a full dossier, if you will, or of research outputs for a PI, let's say, on a grant proposal. And having a system in which the library can curate descriptive information about a researcher or a professor or staff member that can better connect them to all of their academic output, regardless of whether that output's in sort of the institutional repository or the digital repository or in the electronic sort of article journal repositories or in the traditional library catalog. I think those will be really powerful internal library uses of being able to be more expansive about what you can say related to entities, broadly speaking, that are important to the library industry.
Awesome. I'm not seeing any other questions. We are just now coming to the end of our time. Are there any other final comments that you would like to make, Jeff, before we go?
No, I just thank you very much. If, like I said, if folks have any other questions about this or how it relates to any other linked data BIB framework we're doing at OCLC, please reach out and I could schedule time to sort of talk about the intersection of our BIB framework and identifiers and WorldCat work with this more future-facing knowledge work that I talked about today.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Jeff. Fantastic presentation. Everyone who's still on the call, keep checking out more sessions. Feel free to review this one. Check out Jeff's PDF. See you later.
Thank you.